Welcome to Journaling with Nature, the podcast for those who want to turn curiosity into wonder, a pencil sketch into a rabbit hole of discovery, a moment of stillness into a life full of joy. I'm your host, Bethan Burton. Let's open the pages of our nature journals and explore this world together. Hello, this is episode 58. Today's podcast is extra special because my guest and I did an interview exchange. Mike Hendley is an artist and the host of one of my favorite podcasts, Drawing Inspiration. So this week we had two very long conversations about nature and art, one that you are about to hear now, and the second is over on Mike's show where I'm the guest. So you can find the link to that sister episode in the show notes or by searching for drawinginspiration.fm/63. But right now we're going to chat with Mike and find out all about his love of exploring nature through art, especially with graphite pencil, his digital nature drawing, and his adventures in podcasting about his passions. Let's listen. Mike, thank you so much for being here with me. This is a very big treat. We are doing a podcast exchange of sorts. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me on, Beth. And it's, this is really fun. I've never done this, and I couldn't think of a better podcast to do it with. So I do appreciate your podcast. I've been listening to it. I love it. So I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you.
So, as you know, I start from the beginning, as you do on your podcast. And there's a really sweet story that you have about finding out that you wanted to be an artist at age 5. And I wonder if you could tell this little anecdote.
Sure. So I'm not that young. I'm 54. So keep that in mind as I tell the story. But so I have a book that has a series of folders in it, and on the top of each folder is a photo of me, and inside it is my report cards and things like that. I think a few of us have that kind of thing. So I was flipping through this a few years ago, and I noticed that on the back side of this folder, you can write down your occupation. And keep in mind, this is 1972. They had occupations listed, and under men, it was doctor and policeman and fireman, and under women was nurse and artist. And I wanted to be an artist, but it was over on the other side. So what I did is I wrote it under men, and then I checked it off. And so, I was pretty sure at 5 years old I wanted to be an artist. It took me a while to get back to it.
I love it. I love that you're smashing gender roles way back then and also claiming your future as an artist. Mm-hmm. And so you said that you went back to it. So this is something that happens often. People give up art at some point in childhood and then they come back to it as adults. And I'd love to hear that story of the coming back.
Yeah, so I went into engineering. I'm a software developer during the day. I've been doing software development for 30 years. When I was going through engineering, we did some isometric projection kind of drawing, and I was really interested in that. I thought that was kind of fun. We just did it with pencil. We were drawing like circles or spheres and blocks, and I was like, this is really fun. But it wasn't until we had our first child, and I was home with her because my wife had the better position, and so I worked from home and she went in, and it was just a better arrangement that way. And in kind of being with her through the day and just trying to be entertaining, I decided to try drawing because she really loved dinosaurs, and I was like, I'm going to draw a dinosaur. You draw silly things with them. So I drew a triceratops for her. And when I drew it, I realized, that's not bad. Like, I was thinking, maybe I should try something else because this looks like a triceratops to me. And it was at that moment that, and this was, I think, 2004, 2005, that I realized, wait a second, I may be able to draw. I may be able to pick up where I left off years ago. And so then it was that Christmas that I drew my first drawing, which was a chickadee, and I gave it to my wife as a present. And she thought it was a photo. So that was further kind of confirmed that maybe I'm on the right track here. And
Wow.
it's just been something as a bit of a hobby for me, which I've taken more seriously in the last couple of years. But yeah, I've really enjoyed drawing.
That's amazing. It was like it's waiting dormant inside you for the right time.
I think it's great to look at the world with children's eyes
Yeah.
and embrace it that way. But there is something to be said for coming back to those things that you enjoyed as a kid and revisiting them as an adult with the lived experience and folding it into your life again. It feels like you're complete. It feels like you've addressed the things you've missed. And, it's always there within us. And we all start drawing. So I'm not surprised that so many people older in life come back to drawing or painting or some other creative indulgence, because many of us are, it's recommended we don't do that, because how are you going to make a living as a starving artist, right? Which is, and it was much harder at my age too, because my dad was blue collar, and, it was recommended that, I should look at other ways to generate revenue. But it's always been there. I found it. So I'm so happy to have done so.
I love that it came from such a place of family and love and connection. Like you were connecting with your daughter, and then to offer that first drawing to your wife as a gift. That's really special. That really loving reconnection with art through family.
Yeah, it's we are better for the people that are around us. And so, and we're also better for those experiences tied with nature, which I strongly believe. So we live in the country. I feel that when I'm outside, I feel like I'm filling my tank, and it's not necessarily my creative tank all the time, but I feel like I'm getting that I'm pulling something from that, and I'm giving something back. And so, love of family, love of nature. That's what's continues to drive me today. So. Yeah.
I'm interested in your connection with nature. Did you have nature back in your childhood? Is that something you reconnected with? How has your connection with nature been through your life?
Man, I've always loved nature. I remember, so, I was talking about when I was 5 years old. I think when I was about 8, a friend of mine, his name was Doug, we built a raft, and we set about on a journey. We didn't know where we were going, but there was a current to this river. So we built a raft on a river. We got on the raft and we just left. And we traveled about 1 kilometer on this, just because we were into nature, and, we were just exploring the world. This is a little village near where I am now. And, being 8, we didn't tie the logs too well, so it started falling apart. So we had to swim to shore, and this was a river where there was always turtles. So this goes back to the nature bit. There was always turtles in the river, but we were told there were 3 giant snapping turtles. These are older kids being mean to younger kids that ate kids. So we're swimming through this river to the shore, and all I'm thinking is, I'm going to die.
Waiting to be eaten.
That's right. But it was a beautiful experience kind of growing up where I did, because there was always snapping turtles. There was a special pond that had so many painted turtles. And then we moved from there to the country. So I grew up on a hobby farm. Okay. And so we had everything except horses. So we had cows and goats and pheasants and chickens and pigs. And it was beautiful to be able to grow up out in that environment. I didn't really appreciate how special it was to live in the country at that age. I mean, you're a teenager. For me, everyone I knew was in the city, so it was more of a pain because I had to drive to see everyone. But in retrospect, it was a very special experience. And I see that now with my daughters, who are like 15 and 19, how much they love where they live because of the exposure to nature. And so I've always had that kind of interest in nature, interest in what's happening out there, why are things happening, what's unique about our area, why does this happen, and so on and so forth. So I've embraced that much more, I would say, in the last 20 years than I did when I was younger.
And nature is the major theme of your artwork now, and even those ferocious snapping turtles have made their way in.
Yes.
Tell me about that as nature for a theme, nature as the theme for your artwork.
So I think I used to take a lot of photographs. I think I've got 60 or 70,000 photos in my
Wow.
In my photo roll. So I've taken a lot of photos. Most of them are nature, and I've gone to places where there is more nature. I've gone to raptor conservancy areas and I'll just to see more nature. As I started getting into pencil work, I realized that for me to understand how to lay graphite down on paper, I would need to have a variance in texture and shape. And there is no better place for that than nature. And so when I'm looking at my next subject, like the snapping turtle is a great example because it's so bumpy and ancient and it's got such an interesting mix of textures that for me it was like, I'm going to try and conquer this and try and give it depth and try and see shadow. I look at, I don't know, it was maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was drawing seagulls out by the river. And I started drawing the seagulls, but then I got distracted by the rocks they were on. So I ended up drawing a bunch of rocks with these little silhouettes of seagulls because I just wanted to get the rocks right because I love the texture. So for me, it's about the texture, but it's about the story. I try not to have animals that are too static. I've complimented many artists that when I look at their work, if I can understand in my mind what was happening a few seconds before this piece and a few seconds after, they're telling a story that I want to watch and I want to hear.
I like that.
I try to do that with mine. I try to, if I can, imply what was happening before and what's happening next. And it's hard sometimes to do that. I don't get it right. But I always think about that. I always think that I don't want it to look like, for example, I did some moths and butterflies. And even with the moths, I tried to focus. I have 2 moths mating. I didn't want the kind of pinned butterfly moth that you always see. I wanted something active. Like it is doing something. It's living its life. And if you see me draw it, maybe you'll try and look for that the next time you go for a walk. So I don't know. I there's so much nature around us. It's so accessible and life is busy and we're looking at our screens and we're missing all this stuff. I'm going on here a little bit, but I was went out on vacation on the east coast of Canada and we were in a, there was a beach and there was a couple of food shacks and all that. And I'm waiting for food and I saw this beautiful, huge spider that was above where we're waiting for the food, socially distanced. There was a big lineup and all that. And I gave up my place in line because I went back to get my camera to take a picture of the spider. So it's always there. We just have to look for it. And that's the exciting thing about nature. There's no sign to say, cool creature here. It's always a treasure hunt. So I love nature.
That's beautiful. I love that you sacrifice your place in the line for art. So your drawings have this extremely detailed, realistic style, and I wonder how you define your style. This is a thing that artists and beginners especially wonder, like, how do I find my style? I'm wondering about thoughts on your own personal style, but also on style in general and how one finds a style.
So I think I'm still struggling. I had Lisa Congdon on my podcast, and she kind of woke me up to this idea of understanding style versus artistic voice and all of that kind of pulled together. She has a book focused on that. And I think I'm still struggling with what I would define as the work that I do. I think my graphite work I think that's pretty established now. It's not, it's realistic. I wouldn't say it's photorealistic because I tend not to focus too much on backgrounds. But I'm really enjoying colored pencil. I tried a version of colored pencil a while ago, and I didn't enjoy it. It kept breaking on me. It wasn't a good experience. I moved to a different kind of colored pencil, and now I love it. I've also moved to watercolor, and I'm really enjoying that, but it's taken me, I think, 6 or 7 times to finally be comfortable with watercolor and letting it do its thing and trying to work with it. So I'm still trying to find my overall style, but I think, if we put style in the container of voice, I think part of the voice that I have is speaking about nature. So I think that's consistent with my work. I'm not sure yet, and I do digital as well. So I'm not sure. For me, it's hard. I will spend time doing digital work for a week, and I just have this deep need after about a week to go back to pencil. So
that's interesting.
And it's the same with colored pencil. It's the same as watercolor. For me, it's what runs through my veins is graphite, and so I need to get back to it every so often because I just love drawing with pencil. So I love the other things just as much as you would your own children, but I have an extra little special spot for graphite.
Yeah, that's so interesting that it's a physical, sort of visceral reconnection with your favorite material, which is graphite. So I'm interested to talk about digital art because it's not something I've played with. It's something that's in my mind and something that I am interested to try, but I have this resistance to it. But I've seen some people make amazing things, and I'd love to hear your experience with digital creation.
So I didn't really do any until a few years ago when I went into an Apple store, and it was the first iPad Pro that had the pencil, and I thought I'd try it out. And I was going through some medical things at that point, and things were getting cleared up, and I thought, once I get the final thing done, I'm going to reward myself with an iPad. So I actually went into the Apple store and I drew a strawberry. I still have that strawberry somewhere. And I thought, this is really nice. Like, that experience, I've tried on like a Wacom tablet and all these previous ones, but when I did it on the iPad, it felt different. It felt special. So I'm on my third iPad Pro now. And I love drawing on the iPad. I used to do it when we didn't have COVID times. I used to do it in coffee shops all the time because it was a smaller kit for me to carry around. And it's easy for me to have a reference photo off to the side. So I have all the tools I need to do what I would like to do. And I'm still... I've bought way too many brushes, so don't go out and buy a bunch of brushes. I use Procreate as my favorite app, but I've used Linnea and Paper and all the others as well. But for Procreate, for me, is kind of the most exciting. It has an animation feature as part of it now, and it allows me to kind of manipulate the background if I choose to. I tend not to do that. I tend to treat the iPad as an analog tool. And even though I've done Inktober 2 years with it, 2018 and 2019, I still treated it like paper and ink. So I had a pencil brush that I used to draw, and then I had an ink that I used for the inking component. And I tried to respect the fact that I was inking, so I tried to kind of protect that a little bit. But I love it. I think that for me, it's made me a better analog artist.
Okay.
And obviously I think the other way around as well, but I think for me it's, except when I draw too much on Procreate, not too much. Let's say I draw, honestly, it takes an hour of me drawing on Procreate, and the step to undo something is tapping with 2 fingers to the screen. I'll spend an hour on Procreate and I'll go and draw something in pencil, and the first time I make a mistake, I'm smacking my paper with 2 fingers, expecting time to go back. Yeah. And I've zoomed as well on paper, so it's tough.
I remember back in university when I was writing a lot of essays and doing, stuff on the computer and in Word, and I remember going to the mall and thinking, I need to find this thing, and in my mind I just wanted to use Control Find for the thing I wanted to find in the mall. The brain is funny.
Yes, it is. That is funny. Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the feel of it. Like, does the pencil, the digital pencil, make it feel like you're using a pencil?
No.
Okay.
So it's a very different feeling. I've used the Apple Pencil a lot on the iPad without anything on the screen. So just the plastic tip on the glass. And I've been fine with it. It's okay. Some people have a real problem with that. I don't. However, in the last couple of years, I've switched to a product called Paper-like, which is a screen protector that you put on. The initial version wasn't great. The current version is actually quite good. And the reason I like it, it does provide a little bit of texture, so it feels a bit more like you're drawing on paper. The thing I really like about it is it really reduces the amount of, or the number of fingerprints that you have on your screen. So for me, that was the big distraction, especially if I was outside in any degree of light. You would start seeing the fingerprints, and it just doesn't look great. But it doesn't highlight them as much as being straight on glass. And then you have the added benefit that there's a little bit more friction. But if I did, and I want to protect the screen a little bit, especially the new ones, they got a really nice screen. I worry about damage. But I love the screen protector. I know that you can buy them off Amazon. I think you've got to be careful because some of the cheaper ones, if you start with like a white canvas, you'll see like a rainbow pattern, which is very distracting.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a difference in quality. I'm not trying to sell the Paper-like, but there is a difference in quality between some screen protectors and others.
And I'm wondering, I'm thinking like, is there subjects you definitely do on the iPad versus subjects you definitely want to render on paper?
That's a really good question. I've tried to do both, and I've consciously just tried to do that. For example, I think the first detailed piece I drew on the iPad was my eye.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I spent 8 or 10 hours or something on drawing my eye. I'd probably do it faster now because I know the tools and stuff, but it was about 8 or 10 hours. I got to a point with colored pencil in the last year and a half, maybe last year, that I drew my eye again, but this time in colored pencil. And I also did it in graphite. So for me, I don't think I'm thinking of analog and digital based on the subject. But, for example, I did a bunch of butterflies on the iPad, but that's just because I had a bunch of butterfly references of my own, and I love butterflies. Yeah. So I was just in that phase, and I wanted to do it on the iPad. So, and at that time, I wasn't really enamored with colored pencil because I was frustrated. So for me at the time, it was graphite, and I hated watercolor. So it was graphite or it was digital. And if I wanted color, I had to go digital. So now I've got a larger toolbox. So, yeah.
Well, tell me about your color pencil frustration and how you settled it in the end. What were the pencils you were using and the ones you're using now?
So I was using the Prismacolor Premiere, and they were okay, but I found that they're a wax-based pencil, I believe, and they were breaking too easily, and it's probably me just being, a bit guerrilla on how I was using them. But I was frustrated, so I bought a smaller set of the Faber-Castell Polychromos. The ones I really like to try are the Caran d'Ache Luminance, but it's really hard to find them in Canada, and they're very expensive. So I thought I'm going to get the Faber-Castell Polychromos, so I bought a small set. And part of this maybe is growing older and just more experience in drawing generally. But when I started using them, it was like, oh my, this is something special. And that's that quick. I did a few pieces. I drew a mushroom. I drew my daughter's eye, I think. And then I quickly started a nature journal. I started with watercolor, and then I moved into colored pencil. And my next piece that I'm working on now is colored pencil. I really like the colored pencils. The problem is I bought a really big set.
Too much choice.
It's too much choice. It's like going into a Blockbuster before Blockbuster shut down and said, let's get a movie. Sometimes it's better to go to that country corner store that has 20 DVDs. So what I tend to do when I do colored pencils is I have like a roll that holds, I think, 24 pencils. And I will pick out my palette from the big box because I think I've got 120 or something. And I'll put them into that roll, and that becomes my kit for this piece. So that kind of reduces my choices. And I did create like a palette sheet where I produce a little sample of each color with a colored pencil from light to dark, which helps me kind of pick my color set, my colored pencil palette. And that becomes a little bit easier. I do like having the options, but there's metallic gold and silver. I'm never going to use those. But now that I'm thinking about it, I wonder if I should try something.
I really like that. The idea of limiting yourself from a wonderful selection for each piece, just making it more simple and harmonious, I guess, by choosing just a simple set.
Yeah, and if you wanted, for example, back to the digital, if you wanted to do that with Procreate, you can take a picture of something and bring that picture into Procreate, and it creates a palette for you.
Ah, interesting.
So if you wanted to get away from that, having to choose it, that's a really cool thing to do. And I've done some degree of nature journaling with Procreate on the iPad in the field. And you can just point your iPad, because it's got the camera built in, and it will create the little palette of whatever you're working on, and off you go. So the screen's actually quite good now that you can work in sunlight and draw, plein air.
Wow. This is all so interesting, and it really does spark me like, should I should I try it, or is that a rabbit hole that is dangerous?
I spoke to a friend of mine who's a digital creator, and he's reviewed the recent iPad Mini that comes with the pencil. So the pencil's like, the iPad Mini is quite small, and the pencil's like the length of the iPad Mini.
Okay.
And Procreate works just fine on it. And it's a nice small screen. So I think if you want to carry something small in the field and you want to sketch and you don't want to spend the big money on an iPad Pro, the iPad Mini, the new one, is really nice. I've thought about, I wonder if I need a smaller one when I travel, but I can't.
You can just go, can't you, with all these different tools?
Yes. Yeah.
So I'd love to go back to those detailed graphite drawings that you do and ask you about your process and how you start, how it continues, and how you finish, and your process for creating one of these beautifully detailed graphite drawings.
Thank you. My favorite tool now is a Pentel Graph Gear 1000 mechanical pencil, and it has 0.3 millimeter lead, so I go with the finest lead, and I only use 2B lead. And I used to use, and I still have, the Staedtler 2 millimeter leads, the clutch pencils they call them, for people use them for drafting. I still have those in my kit. I don't really use them unless I want to cover a large surface. So that's my preferred pencil. And what I tend to do when I start a piece is I feel bad for saying this, so maybe somebody out there does the same thing and they'll be like, yes, but I don't do the big, like if I'm drawing a duck, I don't draw the head and the body and throw in lines to understand. I just start at the beak and then I start building it out. And I may have the eyes fully complete before I even get beyond the neck. It's just the way that I draw. So
I was watching a video of yours and I saw this pattern and I thought, is he really doing that? That's incredible, because it's like it's growing in full detail out of this one point. It's really fascinating.
Yeah, I don't fuss because it's pencil. I'm not erasing. I tend not to erase too much, but I'll talk about how I do that. Because you're doing it so lightly and I'm doing layers upon layers, I don't see a point to kind of drawing it all out, except if I'm working with a subject where I need to wrap other things around it. So I want to make sure that when I draw, because I did it recently, I was doing a duck on a 11 by 14 and I drew it out and then I realized I'm going to have to cut off her feet, because I had drawn it too big. So I was like, oh. So there are times when I need to be more cognizant of that, and it's okay. You can just start again. It's pencil, but I do tend to, when I do areas like the head or the body, I do go in really light to get kind of the parameters. And then I want to set the range for the values. So that's why I always like to do the eyes first, because typically there's some part of the eye that's really black. I like the highlight. I've said this before, but I feel like when I get the eyes done, the drawing has a way to speak to me at that point, because I can look at its eyes, and that helps me. I did a woodpecker. I think it was maybe my fourth or fifth drawing. I spent 45 hours on this woodpecker. I drew the tree trunk it's on 3 times. I erased everything 3 times. It winked at me one day, and I told my wife, I think I'm done. I think we're good. So for me, it's about getting that value range. So the eye's always very good. There may be some shadow under a wing. I'm thinking of, let's say, a bird or a duck. And then coming in with areas of the beak, which may be kind of a yellow color. So I've got to translate that into graphite. And I just tend to layer it up, and you just slowly layer bits on top of it. And you can do everything, in my mind, with 2B. You don't need to be fussing with HB to 6B to 8B. If you just have a 2B, it gives you everything. And the reason I went with mechanical pencils is because I was carrying my kit to work and sketching at lunch. And I didn't want to carry a sharpener because the lead gets everywhere. So for me, the mechanical pencil solved the problem. So that's why I eventually moved into this versus carrying a... But I did find a nice sharpener for the 2mm clutch pencils that's contained. So yeah, I tend not to use wooden pencils, but I do have black wings and everything else that I do play with because they're lovely to hold.
That's so fascinating. I love the way that it developed, that you come to your own tools for your own reasons like that you didn't want to carry a sharpener. So here you found your favorite pencil. I'm wondering how you choose your next subject. Is it just something that you've seen out the window? Do you have a big long list of things you want to tackle?
Yes, I have. So I'm an Apple person. So I've got, iPhoto or Apple Photos, I guess. That's how old I am. It was iPhoto at some point. So I have an album I created called Drawing Subjects.
Oh,
and
cool.
So I go through and I find photos. Sometimes I'll just say, okay, I'm going to find all the turtles I have, and I'll dig them all out, and then I'll favorite a few, and then I'll throw them into that folder and just save them there. And for me, it's about, I've encountered so many animals. We've rescued so many animals around our neighborhood. And I do help with kind of wild birds that get hurt here as well. So I'm called out for this area of town if anything ever happens. But so I've got pictures of all of this stuff, and for me, it's a matter of, and once again, it's the textures. Like the snapping turtle, it's like I don't know, it's a lot of texture. I eventually did it, and I was happy I did. And then I saw a friend of mine doing a rhinoceros, and I thought, well, that's going to be really challenging. So I did one, and it was only, I think, an hour and a half, 2 hours. I was very short, but I did do one, but I used an image from Unsplash. So I always, if I'm using an image that's not mine, I always make sure there's no copyright around it. So I'm not the Pinterest kind of person. I go to Unsplash or to Pixabay, and that's where I grab my references. But we don't have any rhinos around here, so I had to use someone else's photo.
That's really cool. So you have this detailed drawing style, and you also have nature journaling, and that's a little different. And I'm interested in how you came to nature journaling as different from your art style, and how these two different forms of creative expression feel for you.
That's a good question. Once again, graphite's always going to be there for me. I think my path to nature journaling took me through urban sketching. And I really liked the idea of urban sketching because I don't know, even when I was a kid, I liked to have a little kit, like a little thing that I would carry with me. And for me, it was just, wow, I could have a sketchbook and a little palette and a little water container and water brushes and these brushes that you break apart and you fold, and they're really nice. And I was like, that's romantic to me. Like that whole idea of being able to just bring this thing with you, and you create something and you bring it home, and look what I did. So I fell into urban sketching that way, and was following a podcast about pens and fountain pens, and I'm thinking, wow, I could draw with fountain pens. And so I went down that route, and I think going through that, I realized I still love nature. So I was drawing buildings, and I recently drew some cars and things like that. And I love doing that. But a friend of mine, an artist in England, did a nature journal, and she published the book, Joe Brown, who was on my podcast. And I was blown away by what she was able to do. And I was thinking, I should just tried drawing some of my stuff in a sketchbook. And I've got these new sketchbooks, and because I don't need any more sketchbooks. And I was thinking, I've got some hot press paper, because I really wanted a sketchbook with hot press paper, which is really hard to find. And I wanted to explore that a little bit. So I started thinking about this idea of nature journaling. And so I started with some watercolor, and I was really enjoying that. And then this was when I brought these colored pencils in, and I was like, wow, I think I love colored pencils again. And so the last few pieces I've done are all in colored pencil. And for me, the nature journal isn't so much I'm going into the woods and I'm drawing what's in front of me and I'm bringing it back as a rough sketch. I do a lot of rough sketching, but for a large part of the year, we've got mosquitoes and black flies and everything else, so that becomes a bit of a problem. This time of year is beautiful. Fall in my area of the world is just wonderful. It's my favorite season. But what I tend to do with the nature journal is I'll put together some images I've done, and I want to tell a story on the page. So that's what I've been trying to do with nature journaling. My next page is about ducks that we actually have in our pond. So I want to show the ducklings and the male and the female and where they nest. And I want it to be kind of a story on the page, which is what a nature journal should be. And so it's a little bit more scripted, and it's much more detailed than I think a lot of people do with nature journaling, but that's just where I come from. And I don't think, I think the fact that you're looking at nature and you're drawing it, or you're painting it, or you're doing it on your iPad, you have that connection and you have that moment, and what you're putting down, you're the only person that can do that. Like we always have to be mindful, regardless of our skill level, what you're doing right now, you are the only person in the world that can do that. You're the only person in the world that can share that story. You need to get it out of you. I forget who, I don't know if it was Austin Kleon or somebody had said, the most expensive real estate in the world is cemeteries, because that's where the ideas go to die. And I want to get all the creativity out of me before my heart beats for the last time. And so I feel like I just always need to be drawing, and whether it's detailed or whether it's rough sketching, we all just need to try it. And so my approach is a little bit different, but I do do a lot of rough sketching. So I don't want people, that's why I try and post the works in progress, because I don't like seeing a feed where it's curated and it's perfect and everything's framed. I want people to, and I've had so many people reach out and say, you've inspired me to try. And that's what I want to hear. And so, yeah.
That's wonderful. I love that you share your works in progress, because perfection is not good for anyone. It's not good for the person who's doing it, and it's not good for the person who's viewing it as well. And so to see that every artist, even when you can produce something that looks like a photograph, the process is messy. The process is different.
Yeah, and it's tough, because a lot of us are posting our work on Instagram or Facebook. It doesn't matter. You're revealing yourself to the world, and you don't know if they're cheering or they're booing.
Yes.
So there's anxiety around that. But the only person that you need to be better than is the person you were yesterday. And it just has to be on one thing. I always look at my work, and I don't think I did a lousy job. I just think I could have done that better. I'm going to try and change that in the future. And I'm really proud of, like, every drawing I've done, I can tell you one small section of that drawing that I'm really proud of. And I think if we focus on those elements, we just need to be better tomorrow. And if it's not tomorrow that we get to it, it's a week from now or a month from now, it's okay. But we just need to be creating. We need to be sharing. And you can consider it a legacy or just a creative experience, because it sends you on a path. I'm doing a podcast because I drew a rhino or triceratops for my daughter. Like, that's the path. We are talking because I drew a triceratops for my daughter. And to be able to connect with wonderful people like you and the listener, I would have not done any of that if I didn't put a dinosaur on paper with a pencil. So who knows what will happen to you.
That's a beautiful way of thinking about it, that one thing leads to another, and here we are. And I'd love for you to talk about the podcast and how that started. What was the driver for you to start your podcast?
So at the time, I was trying to find a podcast that was at my level. Like
Mhm.
I was trying to understand. So I started the podcast 2.5 years ago. And at the time, I had a theme for the year. I like to have themes for the year that helps me focus. So my theme for that year was emergence. I was going to take the stand that I'm emerging as an artist. And so part of that was creating the podcast. And the reason I created the podcast was I wanted to talk to artists one on one. I wanted to understand what makes them tick. I want to hear it because I have no formal art training at all. I took a workshop one weekend, but I have I have no other art training. So I wanted to hear from these people directly and be able to extract from them bits of wisdom, some skills, some tools on just how to make myself better. And I thought the podcast was great because it gives me a venue for that, but then I can share it with others because I knew other people who were my age who were trying things for the first time, and there was paint nights and all this other stuff that was happening, right? And so for me, the podcast was something that I was comfortable with because back 30 years ago, I used to have a radio show about the internet when it just started. I remember
Wow.
doing a big piece about Windows 95 when it came out. But so for me, the idea of talking was okay. I was comfortable with that. And I'm a techie, so I knew how to set up the podcast and manage the graphics and all that kind of stuff. So that didn't frighten me. I was worried that I wouldn't get enough guests. And so what I decided to do was to stagger it. So sometimes I have a guest. Other times it's just me. And for every episode, you're going to get me, just me, at the beginning. And I'm just trying to share my journey so that people can say, oh, cool. And they reach out to me and like, I did that too, or can you recommend this? Or what was that thing you were talking about? Rather than it just being an interview. Because the podcast is about my journey and it's about the guests. And sometimes it's more my journey and sometimes it's less my journey. But that's what it is. I am not a professional. I am just somebody sharing my words and my thoughts. And I'm hoping it inspires others. And this also is something that my children can look back on in years from now and hear their
Mm.
dad talking about his journey as an artist. Because I think what's important, like my kids are looking at what they want to do for a living, right? And I think the fact that they see their dad doing something different a lot of the time in his spare time is something I want them to remember when they get through their careers and decide to switch, that it's okay to do that. It's okay to embrace something new and be old enough to realize that you can't just drop things and go because you have commitments, but it's okay to explore yourself and what you want to do. So for me, that's the thing I'm thinking about as well. Is I wonder when they hear my voice in 40 years or 50 years, what are they going to think about? So yeah, that's why I do the podcast.
That's incredible. It never occurred to me that it would be something for kids and grandkids to listen to later. It's a really, really special, beautiful thing.
And you're doing it as well.
Yeah, why didn't I think of that before?
The only thing that I've kind of I had to be clear with my wife is if I pass first is providing instruction on how to keep the podcast online. So this is part of maintaining your digital impact on the world after you pass. And so I provided instruction on how to do that. Just pay a bill every month and it'll be fine. Yeah.
So interesting. That's beautiful. I'm wondering, I love that you have so much of you in the podcast. And so at the beginning, even when it's an interview show, you have a section where you're describing what you're working on and the barriers and the challenges and the wonderful things that you've done. And yeah, I would say there's so much of you in the podcast, and that's what makes it really special.
Thanks. I've had so much positive feedback and support, and I appreciate you saying that. That's very kind. I was surprised to hear so many, and I know people probably do this with your podcast where they listen to it when they're painting or when they're drawing, but I hear people who listen to it because they're going out running or they like to listen to my voice first thing in the morning. So I've played with the idea of a new podcast as well. So I'm not sure what I'm going to do yet, but I think I may do something that's shorter and more regular. But if people are enjoying this experience, I want to kind of give more if I can. But I think that if you're trying to sell your art, you need to sell yourself. and we all have interesting stories. I mean, to hear from you about the magpies in Australia and the land that's trying to kill you, but we kind of agreed that we have bigger mammals. I think, this is what makes our art special, is the artist. And I think having an opportunity to share my story, to engage with other artists and dig deep into what makes them tick. And it's so funny because you've probably come across this as well. You have an artist talk about something they've not spoken about ever, possibly, or they've only spoken about it with their partner. And now it's coming out again, and they're reliving this experience, this positive experience, or this emotion through something that they went through. And to be there for that and to help be a bit of a catalyst for that experience is also just, it's pretty special.
That's amazing. And how do you choose your guests? Is it people you want to know more about? Is it people you admire? You've had some high profile guests on your show already.
Yeah, it was so funny because there was one person I wanted on my podcast, and he said yes the next day. And I was blown away when he was on, and he turned 91 this year. So I was so pleased to have Robert Bateman on the podcast, who is a famous Canadian painter. My focus is visual arts, but I had a woman who engraves on glass. So that was a really interesting experience. I've had people I had somebody who's known for his podcast about pens. So the pen addict, Brad Dowdy, he was on talking about pens. So for me, I want to understand everything about visual arts. So I've had oil painters, and I've never touched oil paint, but yes. I have listeners that do. And so I want to make sure that, we're talking about all of this. And the reason I call it Drawing Inspiration is because it's about drawing, but I'm also trying to draw inspiration from my guests. So that's kind of the reason for it. And so I'm trying to match kind of everyone's expectations about visual arts. I haven't done anything around sculpture, I don't think. At some point, maybe I will explore that. But I've had artists on like James Gurney, Robert Bateman, Andy J. Pizza, and I've had really small artists in the sense that they may only have 2,000 or 3,000 people. Kina Forney, who's a local artist here, she was on the podcast. And when I say small followers, I mean like on Instagram. But she's an early stage artist. I've had kind of quite a few artists who are early in their career. Mm-hmm. And for me, they all have compelling stories. And some of the more interesting, applicable things I've heard are from some of those people who are just starting out. So I find my artists on YouTube, on Instagram, on Twitter. A guest may tell me, you need to interview this person. And so I find them everywhere except Robert Bateman, because he has no online presence except his website. But everyone else it's being curious. I mean, you talked about this intentional curiosity for a podcast, and I know that you do this because I love your podcast. If you apply that to a podcast and not just your art, you will be successful. Yes. And so that is, intentional curiosity you nailed it. And I think that's exactly what we do, and that's why we do it.
Yeah, I 100% think that the things we learn by connecting with nature, by being curious, by being attentive, those things translate into better human relationships, into better life in general, like moving through the world with curiosity and attention. That's a really important way to be in the world.
Yeah, I think that we need to be more curious. I think we also need, and I think maybe this happens, I would hope this happens as you get older, but I think a lot of us could, I'm trying to be more humble. So I think a degree of humility is something we can all, I don't think you can take on too much of it, but I think that's something that it's okay to take on, because I think a lot of art, whether it's digital or analog, you're always trying to push your wares, and it's tough sometimes, and it's tough asking for help. And I think it's okay to reach out. I think we need to be able to connect with others, whether they're artists or not, and being humble about the work that we're doing is really key, I think, to being able to move your creative journey forward. I think it's really, really important.
And I think that you have that interwoven in your work, in that this podcast, this whole art journey is you sharing your experience of growth. So you start at the beginning and you share with your listeners and your audience, I'm learning about color pencils. I'm hating it. I found some good ones, or I really have this resistance to watercolor, but it's coming together. And so, you're not saying I'm the artist here, learn from me. You're saying I'm learning. Do you want to come along with me? And I think that's a really special ingredient.
Thank you. Yeah, it's. I think for me, it buys me a mulligan on everything I say, because I'm like, I don't know. I was just learning. I'm just figuring it out. It's not going to maybe sell my art to collectors, as well as, I'm the best artist. I am so good. I've trained under these people, or whatever the case.
Yeah.
But that's not why I'm doing this, and that's not why I'm doing my art. So thank you for mentioning and noticing that.
So at the end of each of your podcast episodes, you offer the listener, or you have your guest offer the listener, a little homework task. And they can take this homework and it integrates what's been spoken about in that episode. And I love this idea. It's genius. And I'd love for you to talk about this idea of homework and why that's an important part of each of your episodes.
So for me, I think it's fine to, we consume a lot of content, and I think that unless it's actionable in some way, then it doesn't move to the next stage. And as artists, we need to try and consume some of this as much as possible, especially if you're starting art again or restarting art. So I always ask the guests for a bit of homework. It could be something as simple as, I had one artist who recommended that, the homework is walk slowly into a room and just observe what's around you. And that could be applied to walking outside. Walk slowly, look down, look at what you're stepping on, look up, see the trees. Observation is an important part to being a good artist. I've had other artists talk about, I had one artist talking about drawing an egg every month. Each day, draw a new egg. And by the time you get to the end of the month, you're going to draw, or paint eggs. You're going to paint a really, really nice egg. So I really like the homework. Even if I do an episode by myself, I like to give homework, and people know that at the end there is going to be some homework. And so I've tried to keep that in every episode. And the reason I do it is actually another podcast. There's a writing podcast that I follow, and they always gave homework at the end. And I'm thinking that was a really good idea. So I decided to adopt it. So I didn't create this. I got it from another podcast, but they always have homework at the very end. And I thought that's a really good idea, especially, you and I are in the same space here. I know a few people, and they probably said it to you too, like, you want to create a visual art podcast that's audio only.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Tell me about that. Tell me what you say to people when they say, can this be done?
Yeah, it's okay to talk about art without having visual art in front of you. I do really good show notes, so everything is available through that. But if somebody's driving in a car and wants to hear about art, or they're painting their own piece and they want to hear two artists chatting, then why not? Like, there are a lot of podcasts. There's a lot of science podcasts I listen to that would benefit from some infographics on a screen in front of me as they're speaking. But it's not there. But I love hearing it. And so even if I end up taking in only 10 or 15 or 20% of what they're saying, it's pleasant. And sometimes it's not, it's not just the content, it's the voice, it's the feeling, it's the enthusiasm. Even when we spoke, when you're going to be on my podcast, even when we spoke, I was enthusiastic after the call. And we're different time zones, so I couldn't go to sleep right away because I was so wound up about all these ideas. And Bethan has me motivated to go and try and do. And so if people can walk away with it, why not? Like, I think you can't judge a podcast just based on the content.
Yeah, I think that that's the goal of it. If you've listened to a podcast and it makes you want to jump up and do something on your paper, then that's done its job, right?
Exactly.
And I'm wondering, as a podcast creator, if you have favorite podcasts that you listen to. So any other art or nature related podcasts that really light you up.
Yours.
That wasn't fishing.
So that's hard because I don't get to podcasts. As soon as you start a podcast, you will listen to less podcasts.
Yes, that's true.
So I do try and listen to a few episodes of Creative Pep Talk by Andy J. Pizza. I try and listen to or watch Draftsman. And Lisa Congdon, I mean, I think she's just lovely. I try and listen to every single one of hers because I think she's just wonderful for everything that she's done and everything that she represents. I think Lisa Congdon's incredible. I'd have to look at my playlist.
Yeah, I sprung that on you. I'm sorry.
I listen to a bunch of science podcasts as well, so I'm trying to think if there's any other, I listen to the Pen Addict, which, they talk about pens and paper, which is always fun. And I listen to Erasable, which is another pencil kind of podcast. So I've listened to them all, but I will go through and kind of curate my list of unread or unlistened. And I'll have to remove them because I'm just not going to get through them. I have probably maybe 60 or 70 hours of podcasts a week. And so I can't listen to that many. So I usually have to cut it down to, 10 or 15.
Yeah.
So, but yours is always there.
Oh, that's so nice. Well, I'm so happy to have found yours too, because that delightful thing that when you find the podcast that just is going to be your favorite for a while, and yours is that for me. And so I've gone back the back catalogue, and that's so delicious to have a back catalogue to go through while you're doing the dishes or doing your own art or whatever. It's really fun, and I'm exploring yours right now.
That's awesome. Thank you. I did something recently. I created these starter packs on the website. So you'll be episode 63, and so that's a lot of content. So I've tried to narrow it down to things like oil painting, ink, graphite, so that if people are coming to it as you would, at episode 60, 61, and you're like, oh, I really love this, but I want to hear all the oil painting ones. I've created these little starter packs where I've kind of pulled those episodes together. You can say, oh, I want to listen to episode 12, 43, and 68, or whatever the case.
That's really, really useful. I love that idea.
Yeah, so that's been fun. I've got I received a lot of positive feedback about that. At least you can narrow it down because they're all numbered. And so it's easy to then, I've got to get to 12, 16, and I'm not telling a story, so you can jump all over the place and it'll be fine. Yeah.
That's fantastic. I'm wondering what keeps you going when things get hard. So you're putting out a regular podcast. That can be a real challenge in itself. You're creating new drawings, making new art regularly. But everyone has down days when things feel a bit like a grind and when inspiration is low. And I'm wondering what lifts you up in those moments? How do you get re-inspired for all this?
This is going to sound really silly. I try and remember that we're just humans being. And so the opportunity for us to have bad days means that the good days will seem that much better. Mm-hmm. And so it's tough sometimes. I found out a friend of mine passed away yesterday that I used to work with. And so it made that day harder. But today's a better day. And I appreciate my family and the people around me and the opportunities I've been given and the future that I have. And so if I have a bad day creatively where I can't draw anything today, like I had too much going on, or the stuff I'm doing is not working out, I am fine with giving myself permission to just not do it today or this week. I've gone 3-4 weeks without drawing, and it's going to be there when I get back to it, and I'll be ready. There's parts of my life that are important. In that 3 or 4 weeks when I'm not drawing, I'm seeing and experiencing things. I'm not, because I'm not drawing doesn't mean I'm still, that I'm not an artist anymore, because I'm still observing. I'm still looking at the world through artist's eyes, and I'm taking photos, and I'm thinking about what I'm going to do next. I'm thinking about story. I'm looking at the art that I've done and thinking about what I could do better in the future. So even if we don't have, pen to paper, pencil to canvas, or sorry, brush to canvas. See, I don't oil paint. Um, it doesn't mean that we're not being successful in being an artist. And so I want to embrace these things that we have, and I want to just be a human, and that means that things aren't all rosy. And it's I say that now because I'm in a good mood. If it was a bad day, I may say something different. And I try and take my own advice, but sometimes it is hard. And when you have a bad day and then you have to be creative, it can be hard. But if I'm really, really stuck, I will just pull out one of my not great sketchbooks. I'll pull out a pencil and I'll just start drawing a circle. And then I'll see that circle may turn into a puffin or a beach ball or a planet. But I will start with a circle, and I will just draw the circle around and around and around, and then I'll think I'll add a little peak here and that. And sometimes that's how I just start drawing. And it may be just nonsense when I'm done. But then I think, oh, I should move to this piece now because I've accomplished this little tiny thing on this little sketch. And it's like, wow, that's a pretty good little tree, or that's a pretty good little rock. I should get to that other piece. And so I'm trying to throw these breadcrumbs down, these little treats for myself, so that I can get pulled back into what I should be doing.
That's a beautiful response, Mike. I love the way it's just very gentle and loving to yourself to say, I'm just doing this. Life is hard sometimes. And even if I don't draw for a month, I'm still an artist. I'm still looking at the world with artist eyes. That's a really, really good reminder. I'm thinking about things you've said, and I think you're an artist, but I think you're a storyteller as well. So you've talked about your very detailed pieces that you want to know what's happened just before, what's happened just after. There's a story. And you talked about telling a story with your nature journal, and you mentioned story a few times. I'm wondering if you identify as a storyteller.
I would love to be a storyteller. I love story. I've done NaNoWriMo, which is National Novel Writing Month. That's the month of November. You write 50,000 words. I've done that once. So I did 50,000 words of a story. And I've got 3 short stories that I've been working on as well. So I would love the opportunity to be a writer. So I think story is always in my mind. I don't necessarily want to do graphic novels and that kind of thing, but I think story is important because I love hearing people's stories. I like to hear, I feel we're richer for absorbing that information, and we're more in tune with people's needs and people's success in life, and we get a better sense of scale as to what is good in the world and what is bad in the world. And story is important. It's really that's clever of you to spot that, but yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on finding creative community, because you are building your own creative community through your listeners, through your Instagram followers, and I'm wondering about building creative community and being connected with creative community and what that means to you for your life and your work.
That's a good question. I'm an introvert.
Me too. I was going to ask you that, actually. That's something we can talk about in a minute.
Yeah, community and I don't always get along. It's easier on social media. So I don't have a huge following anywhere, but I think the followers I have are interested and they interact. I get many messages through all different platforms, whether it's Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. And I try and be responsive. I'm not always great at that, so I try to improve upon it. I have a Patreon, as I know you do, and I think that's a great opportunity. I'm struggling with Patreon for Mike as the artist versus Patreon for the podcast. I have a Patreon for the podcast now, and I would encourage the listener, if you can hear my voice, support Bethan and her Patreon. Because it is a lot of work, and it's hard to build community around a podcast. And it's 8 to 10 hours a week or per podcast to kind of put this all together.
Yeah.
And so community is important. It's important to be able to manage the give and the take. And I mentioned in my podcast, and we spoke about Clubhouse, which is a recent kind of experience, and be able to connect with people at an audio level. I think that's been very special for me with connecting with artists, because you're catching them in the moment. It's not a scripted response through Instagram. It's like, I can't talk right now, or
yes.
I just got my I just won an award for my documentary. There's one artist on there who does amazing work, and she just won an award for her documentary that she created. So just being in the moment to be able to feel people's emotions is important. And I try to be open. I try to share my story. I try and be encouraging. There's people that I've reached out to that I wanted a response from and I never got. And so I want to try and be supportive when I can. And it's hard with a full-time job. I wish I could do the podcast and my art as my full-time position, but I can't. So I think community is important. And I've created a Discord server so people have an opportunity to connect on Discord as well. It is hard, though, because you end up spreading yourself too thin.
Yes, I can see that. Yeah.
Yeah. Because you end up with Twitter, Instagram. I post on Reddit, Facebook, Discord, Clubhouse. Like, it goes on, and TikTok. I've tried the TikTok thing. I'm not dancing, but I've tried posting the TikTok. I feel like that algorithm is very favorable for artists right now. It's a matter of gaining followers and interactions. But community is important. I think by nature of the podcast, it's there. It's always there. I mean, we talked about this, I think it was offline. We were talking about podcasts, and you look at the numbers with the podcast, and you can't really measure community that way. And, my numbers were doubling for 2 or 3 months, and then they tanked back to the way they were before that. And I was like, oh my God, what am I doing wrong? And then I received an email about somebody who spends 99% of their day in bed, who was coming back to art. I think he's in his 50s or 60s. And that's all I needed. Like, I didn't need the numbers. I just needed to hear that story.
Yes.
And so, sorry, tearing up over that one.
Yeah.
So it's down to the story. It's down to that community. And, I'll speak for you in saying that if you like what we're saying as podcasters, reach out to us. I mean, we love to hear from you. It's the fuel that keeps us moving forward. And a bit of Patreon helps. But those stories of the person who is finding it really valuable through the pandemic, or it's so good to hear those stories. It's so connective and important. Yeah, I had somebody reach out who was, I think he was, I don't know if, actually I shouldn't say that. I don't know the gender of this person, but they were 12, and they were inspired by the podcast, and they want to do their own. So had nothing to do with art. I think that, they enjoy doing art, but they were so inspired by the podcast that they want to start their own podcast. I never even thought of that connection, but it's we don't realize the impact on people until they tell us, and sometimes they don't, and that's okay.
Yeah, but that's amazing, because you were talking before about having drawn a dinosaur for your daughter means that we're talking today. And so because you drew a dinosaur for your daughter, someone else might start a podcast. And that is so powerful and wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to be part of somebody's story, even if they forget my name, in 20, 30, 50 years from now. Yeah. And it's, maybe it's not a huge deal, but one person, you don't want to be famous, I don't want to be famous, but it's nice to have an impact and to be part of people finding joy in being a human
I love
being.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. I'm so interested in this idea of introversion and putting ourselves out there, because I'm an introvert too, and being the person speaking isn't necessarily my comfortable place, but I had a desire and need to make this connection through the podcast, and so it feels kind of funny to be introverted and yet the one who's speaking a lot of the time. And I'm interested in your experience as an introvert, putting yourself out there and speaking up.
It's been hard for me. I remember so many times, like I'd have a birthday party and my aunts and uncles would come over and I'd spend the whole day crying in my room because I was just overwhelmed by all the people and all the voices in the house. I can act as an extrovert fairly well, but it is exhausting. I've done a few kind of podcasting's a little bit different. Even being an introvert, it's just one-on-one. I'm not thinking about a bunch of people. Even speaking one-on-one is challenging sometimes. But for me, when I go, let's say, do a plein air thing where, a bunch of artists go out and paint or draw outside, I love doing that. I love seeing what people do. I love hearing their stories. I love seeing their tools. And I just love that experience. But when I come home, I need a nap.
Yes.
Because it is so draining. There is a book by Susan Cain called Quiet, and it speaks to introverts. And I wish that I had read that book, or that it was available when I was 14, 15. Because, and even with my kids going through school, the teachers were suggesting that being introverted was not a desirable thing. That they need to speak up more, that they need to be more interactive in class. Like that was some reflection of success. And so it still happens. And I'm sure it's still happening in schools now. My daughter's a little bit older now, but I'm sure it's still happening. And I think that we just need to understand ourselves and not necessarily change ourselves. I think that sometimes we change ourselves without putting the effort into understanding who we are and understanding how we consume information. The fact that, just realizing, wow, like I didn't realize till a few years ago that when I'm out with a group of people, whether it's family or friends or whatever, that I'm really exhausted at the end of that. I didn't really think about this being a pattern until I realized it was a pattern, and embracing the fact that this is what makes me who I am. And as long as I build that time in, I'm okay. So I don't think that doing a podcast will help you if you're introverted, but I don't think being an introvert should stop you from doing a podcast.
Yes. And I love what you said about having a bit of knowledge about ourselves and how important that is and how empowering that is. I remember I have, we are born this way. We are born the way we are. And so I have been sensitive my whole life. And as an adult, I came across this book called The Highly Sensitive Person, and it's by an author called Elaine Aron. And I remember reading about sensitivity and just having that knowledge to be able to read about myself and to say, oh yeah, sensitivity isn't something that's negative. It's just something that is inside us. But just having that knowledge of it was really powerful, really life-changing.
Yeah, it's introspection. I mean, we talk about artists. I mean, one of the most important skills we have is the ability to observe. And then, translating that onto paper and canvas is what we spend our whole life getting good at. And we have to work at observing as well and improving that over time. And, we squint our eyes to more roughly estimate what we're looking at instead of being focused on the details. And I don't think that we close our eyes enough in that way when we look at ourselves. We tend to focus on the small details, the small imperfections. And I think we need to squint and try and look at ourselves in a way that we embrace who we are and we're able to navigate life with our uniqueness. And it's fine to hear this if you're in a good mood. If you're not in a good mood or you're down, it's harder to consume it. but you know what? It will get better. And even if you're down, I was, I lost my mom to cancer when I was 17. And it's horrible because my dad was blue collar. I was devastated. Suicide was, it was there. And I had a good group of 2 or 3 friends that just hung out with me. And that helped me through about 3 or 4 years. And, my wife knows that's a wound that's still open.
Yeah.
And I don't think art is filling it. I don't think anything of that. But when I experience things in life, my reaction involves an ingredient from my past, and that's one of them. And so I kind of wandered again here, but I think that it's we need to embrace ourselves more than we have, and rather than try and fit ourselves into a mold. And that's artists do this all the time. We have this imposter syndrome we go through. We try and be like other people instead of putting something down on paper or whatever the case, and then looking at it as ourselves and what we're trying to achieve, and being open to criticism and being open to talking to others. And that brings back to your point about community and how important that is. But it's understanding who you are. It may take a while. I would say it's taken me 45 years to figure out who I was. I hope the person listening can do it in a shorter time period, but it took me a while. Yeah.
Mike, thank you for sharing that moment of vulnerability. I love the way you are in the world. I love that it is very, very genuine and very sensitive to yourself and to others, and that's a beautiful way to be.
Thank you very much.
I wonder about your hopes for the future of Drawing Inspiration podcast and for your own art practice. What are your big dreams?
Well, if I say them and they don't happen.
Yeah, okay. Tell me what the next thing is. Tell me what's next for you.
I still have more to learn. I still have more things that I'm intentionally curious about. So the podcast is not stopping anytime soon. I have considered taking some of the interviews and turning it into a book, because there's a lot of information in there. So I'll openly say that. I'm thinking of doing, like I talked about a different podcast. It may be more that there's some video that's part of that as well. So I'm thinking it could be 10, 15 minutes of me drawing and just talking about things in the world. Not instructional, nothing like that. Just, watch me draw and I'll just talk about something that's going on or whatever. So I've thought about doing that. With regard to my art, I'm still wanting to make that more significant in my life. And so I've been doing some illustration work. I am exploring selling my digital work through things like NFTs, which is a big thing now, where people are trying to sell their digital work in a way that makes more sense, where you can properly connect yourself to that work and possibly have additional revenue down the line as well. So I've been exploring that, and I've published my first collection as well. But I think, I've got a full-time job. I just want to draw and do watercolor. But I just want to do this. I would love to do, I have thoughts of doing a children's book. I'm open to what the future's going to bring me. But in the meantime, I just need to get better, and I just need to experience more paper and pencil, but I also need to experience more people, so more artists, more voices. And I think next year will be better than last year. So
that's beautiful. Yeah. I love that. And again, it goes back to what you said. You don't know what's coming up. You do this thing, you draw a dinosaur with your daughter, and then you have a podcast, and then who knows? We'll see about the future.
I'm looking forward to the opportunity, once again, of just being a human, like just having the opportunity to have this variance in and being able to connect with people and connect with experiences and just continue drawing and painting and then graphite and always coming back to graphite. So
that's really special. I wonder if you can let us know the very best way to connect with you online.
So there's a few ways to find me. You can go, so the podcast is drawinginspiration.fm. You can search all the podcast players for just Drawing Inspiration. You can find my site at mikehendley.com. I post my work in kind of a microblog format, so all the work that I post on Instagram, I post there. I'm also on Instagram as Mike_Hendley. I'm on Twitter as Mike Hendley. I'm on Reddit as well, but everything can be found through mikehendley.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining me and for doing this podcast exchange. It's been such a joy to get to know you and to get to know your work. And I'm just going to keep exploring the back catalogue of Drawing Inspiration. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate the time. I love your show. Keep doing what you're doing. It really has an impact on all of us, including me. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation with Mike. If you enjoy podcasts about nature and art, which you probably do if you're still listening to this one, do check out his podcast, Drawing Inspiration. There's a really lovely mixture of solo shows and interviews, and in each episode, Mike takes you on a gentle wander through his process and progress in his ongoing art adventures. It's the perfect show to turn on when you're working on your own art for a little inspiration and very good company. Thank you so much for listening. See you next week.